The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds when Flight 447 began boarding at Atlanta's busy airport. Inside the terminal, an 8-year-old girl named Lily clutched her grandmother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was her first time on an airplane, and despite everything happening in her young life, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of anticipation in her chest. "Come on, sweetie," her grandmother Rose said gently, guiding her down the jet bridge. Rose was in her early 60s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried their small bags while Lily hugged a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest, a gift from her mother before the accident. As they found their seats in row 12, Lily pressed her face against the window, watching the workers load luggage below. Rose helped her settle in, making sure her seatbelt was fastened properly and her rabbit was safe in her lap. The little girl's braided hair was decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly whenever she moved her head. "Grammy, look how tiny the cars are," Lily whispered, pointing outside. Rose smiled, though there was sadness behind her eyes. This trip to California wasn't a vacation. They were moving, permanently. After the accident that took Lily's parents 3 months ago, Rose had been caring for her granddaughter, but her small apartment in Atlanta wasn't enough. Lily's aunt in Los Angeles had a bigger home and had insisted they come live with her. It was the right decision, Rose knew, but leaving everything familiar behind was hard on both of them. A few rows behind them, a man in his mid-30s settled into his seat with practiced efficiency. His name was David Torres, and he didn't look like someone you'd pick out of a crowd as special. He wore simple jeans and a gray t-shirt with a military-style watch on his wrist. His duffel bag went into the overhead bin with ease, and he sat down in the aisle seat, his eyes naturally scanning the cabin. David was a Navy SEAL, though no one on this flight knew it. He'd just finished 2 weeks of intense training exercises and was finally heading home to see his wife and daughter. He was the kind of tired that went bone deep, but years of service had taught him to stay alert even when exhausted. It was just instinct now, always watching, always aware of his surroundings. The last passengers were still boarding when a man in an expensive business suit made his way down the aisle. His name was Richard Crawford, and everything about him screamed impatience. He checked his boarding pass twice, his face twisting into a scowl when he realized his seat was 12A, the window seat next to Lily. "You've got to be kidding me," Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for Rose to hear. Rose looked up, offering a polite smile. "Good morning." Richard didn't return the greeting. Instead, he shoved his leather briefcase into the overhead compartment with more force than necessary, making several passengers glance his way. When he finally sat down, he made a show of adjusting his suit jacket and pulling out his phone, his body language clearly communicating his displeasure. Lily, unaware of the tension, was busy organizing her small backpack. She pulled out a coloring book and a box of crayons, setting them carefully on the tray table her grandmother had lowered for her. The book was filled with pictures of butterflies and flowers, and several pages were already colored in with the careful, slightly messy strokes of a child's hand. "Grammy, can I color the butterfly page?" Lily asked softly. "Of course, honey. Just try to keep everything neat, okay?" Richard glanced over at the coloring supplies and rolled his eyes. He pulled out his laptop and opened it with a sharp click, his fingers already flying across the keyboard before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and David watched with mild interest, though he'd seen it hundreds of times before. His attention was drawn to the little girl a few rows up, who was watching the flight attendant with complete fascination, mimicking the motion of putting on an oxygen mask. It reminded him of his own daughter, Sophia, who was about the same age. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Lily gripped her grandmother's hand. "Is it scary, Grammy?" "Not at all, sweet girl. It's like a ride. You'll see." The engines roared to life and the aircraft began picking up speed. Lily pressed herself back into her seat, her eyes squeezed shut as the plane lifted off the ground. When she finally opened them and saw the city shrinking beneath them, her face broke into a huge smile. "We're flying. Grammy, we're really flying." Even Richard couldn't help but glance at the girl's pure joy, though his expression remained sour. He went back to his laptop, typing aggressively. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, The cabin settled into a comfortable hum. Rose pulled out a book and Lily focused intently on her coloring, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she tried to stay within the lines. David leaned his head back and closed his eyes, though he wasn't really sleeping. The sounds of the plane were familiar and almost comforting. The rush of air, the occasional ding of the call button, the murmur of conversations. He could hear the little girl humming softly to herself as she colored. Everything seemed routine, normal, just another flight. Then Lily's coloring book slipped from her tray table. It happened in slow motion, the way these things do. The book tumbled off the edge and landed in the aisle with a soft thump. A few crayons rolled after it, one stopping right by Richard's polished leather shoe. "Oh no," Lily gasped, immediately unbuckling her seatbelt to retrieve her things. "Lily." "Wait," Rose started to say, but her granddaughter was already leaning into the aisle. Richard's head snapped toward them, his eyes cold. "Can you control your kid?" He snapped at Rose. "This isn't a playground." Rose felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, she's just what? Being a nuisance?" Richard's voice was loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "I paid for this seat and I shouldn't have to deal with this." Lily froze, her small hand hovering over her coloring book. Her bottom lip began to tremble. "She's 8 years old," Rose said quietly but firmly. "And she's not bothering anyone. She dropped her book by accident." "Yeah, well, maybe she should stay in her seat where she belongs," Richard shot back. He picked up the crayon by his foot and tossed it toward Lily with a flick of his wrist. Not quite throwing it at her, but close enough to make the gesture hostile. David's eyes opened. He sat up straighter in his seat, his attention now fully focused on the situation developing several rows ahead. His jaw tightened slightly. A flight attendant approached, drawn by the raised voices. "Is everything okay here?" Richard immediately switched into a different mode, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm just hoping we can have a peaceful flight. I've got important work to do and I'd appreciate a little consideration." The flight attendant looked between Richard, Rose, and Lily. "Of course, sir. Everyone, let's just try to stay comfortable and respectful of each other's space." Rose pulled Lily back into her seat, helping her buckle up again. The little girl's eyes were shiny with unshed tears and she clutched her rabbit tighter, the joy from earlier completely gone. Rose wrapped an arm around her granddaughter's shoulders and whispered something comforting in her ear. Richard returned to his laptop, but his body language remained rigid, annoyed. He muttered something under his breath that Rose couldn't quite hear, but she caught enough to know it wasn't kind. David settled back in his seat, but he wasn't relaxing anymore. Something in his gut told him to stay alert. He'd learned to trust that instinct over years of dangerous missions. His eyes kept drifting back to row 12, watching. The plane flew on through the clear sky, cutting west toward California. Most passengers were reading, sleeping, or watching movies on their screens. Everything looked normal, but David knew better. He'd seen enough conflict in his life to recognize the signs of something building. The tension in that row was like a cord pulled too tight, and cords like that had a way of snapping. 20 minutes passed, and the cabin had settled into that quiet rhythm that happens on long flights. Most people were lost in their own worlds, some sleeping, others scrolling through phones or watching movies. But in row 12, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Lily had tried her best to be good. She sat perfectly still, coloring as quietly as possible, barely moving except to carefully select each new crayon. Her grandmother, Rose, kept glancing at her, heart aching at how the little girl had shrunk into herself. The joy from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made Lily check over her shoulder every few minutes, making sure she wasn't doing anything wrong. Richard continued typing on his laptop, but his irritation seemed to be growing rather than fading. Every small sound from Lily, the soft scratch of crayon on paper, the tiny click of beads in her hair when she moved, seemed to make his shoulders tense up more. He was like a pot slowly coming to a boil. Rose tried to lighten the mood. "Lily, that butterfly is beautiful. Look at those colors you picked." "Thanks, Grammy," Lily whispered so quietly it was almost hard to hear. Richard's fingers stopped typing. He turned his head slowly toward them. "Could you two possibly be quiet? Some of us are trying to work here." Rose felt a spark of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "We're barely speaking." Well, it's distracting, Richard said, his voice sharp. I've got a major presentation when I land and I need to focus. Then maybe you should have bought a first-class ticket, Rose replied, surprising herself with her boldness. She wasn't usually confrontational, but watching this man bully her granddaughter was too much. Richard's face flushed red. For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something harsh, but he seemed to catch himself. Instead, he jabbed at the call button above his seat with unnecessary force. A flight attendant appeared within a minute, a young woman with a professional smile. Yes, sir? How can I help you? I need to change seats, Richard said flatly. I can't work in these conditions. The flight attendant's smile wavered slightly. I'm sorry, sir, but this is a completely full flight. There are no available seats in economy. Then upgrade me. I'm afraid first class is also full today, sir. Is there something specific that's making you uncomfortable? Perhaps we can— Yes, there's something specific, Richard interrupted, lowering his voice, but not enough. I specifically bought a window seat to have some peace and quiet. And instead I'm stuck next to— He paused, his eyes sliding toward Lily and Rose with unmistakable contempt. This situation. The flight attendant's expression tightened. She'd clearly dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was heading into territory that made her uncomfortable. Sir, I understand flights can be stressful, but all of our passengers have a right to be here. Perhaps I could offer you a complimentary beverage. We have— Fine. Scotch. Neat, Richard said, cutting her off again. David, several rows back, had been watching this entire exchange. His training had taught him to read people, to spot trouble before it fully developed. And right now every instinct he had was telling him that Richard Crawford was trouble. The man's body language, the way he was speaking, the obvious disdain he was showing, it all added up to someone who was going to cause problems. David caught the flight attendant's eye as she walked past his row. Something in his expression must have conveyed his concern because she gave him a small, tight nod. She'd noticed too. The flight attendant returned a few minutes later with Richard's drink. Here you are, sir. Please let me know if you need anything else. Her tone was professional, but there was an edge to it now. Richard took the glass without thanking her and downed half of it in one gulp. He went back to his laptop, but his typing was aggressive, each keystroke a small act of violence against the keyboard. Lily tried to go back to her coloring, but her hands were shaking slightly. She accidentally knocked her crayon box and it tilted on the tray table. Rose quickly steadied it before anything could fall. Careful. Baby, Rose whispered. I'm sorry, Lily said, her voice small and scared. You don't have anything to be sorry for, Rose assured her, loud enough for Richard to hear. She was making a point now, refusing to let this man make her granddaughter feel like she'd done something wrong. The plane hit a patch of turbulence. Not anything major, just a few bumps that made the overhead bins rattle slightly. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom asking everyone to return to their seats and buckle up. For most passengers, it was barely noticeable. But for Lily, who'd never flown before, the sudden movement was startling. Her hand jerked, and the crayon she was holding made a long mark across her butterfly drawing. Worse, the sudden movement knocked her crayon box right off the tray table. Crayons exploded everywhere. They rolled across Lily's lap onto Rose's seat, and several bounced onto Richard's keyboard and tray table. One bright red crayon landed directly in what remained of his scotch, immediately starting to dissolve into the amber liquid. No, no, no. Lily gasped, reaching for the crayons instinctively. Lily, stay buckled, Rose said, trying to gather the crayons from their side while keeping her granddaughter safely in her seat. Richard stared at the red crayon floating in his drink, watching the color bleed out into the alcohol. For a long moment he was completely still. Then his hand slowly closed around the glass and David could see the man's knuckles turning white from several rows away. Are you kidding me right now? Richard's voice was low and dangerous. Are you kidding me? It was an accident, Rose said quickly, reaching over to try to grab the crayons from Richard's area. The turbulence— I don't care about the turbulence. Richard's voice was rising now, heads turning throughout the cabin. I've had it with this. I paid good money for this flight, and I've been dealing with this nonsense the entire time. He stood up abruptly, and Lily shrank back against her grandmother, her eyes wide with fear. Sir, please sit down, Rose said, her voice shaking now. You're scaring her, Oh, I'm scaring her? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's rich. Maybe if someone had taught her how to behave in public, we wouldn't be in this situation. The flight attendant was hurrying down the aisle now, along with a male colleague. Sir, I need you to sit down immediately. The seatbelt sign is on. I'll sit down when I'm good and ready, Richard shot back. He was fully standing now, towering over Lily, who was pressed against her grandmother, tears streaming down her face. First, I want an apology. And I want to know what you're going to do about my laptop if any of these crayons damaged it. Richard, please, Rose said. And David noticed she'd used his name. She must have heard it when he was checking in. She's just a child. She's been through so much lately and… I don't care what she's been through, Richard interrupted, and now his face was twisted with something uglier than just anger. You people always have some sob story, some excuse for why the rules don't apply to you. The cabin went silent. Even the engine noise seemed to fade into the background. Because everyone had heard it. Everyone knew what he meant by you people. Rose's face went pale, then flushed with anger and hurt. She pulled Lily closer, shielding her with her body. That's enough, the male flight attendant said firmly, moving between Richard and the grandmother and child. Sir, you need to sit down right now or we'll have to… Or you'll what? Richard challenged, spinning toward the flight attendant. I know my rights. I'm a paying customer and I'm the victim here. David was already unbuckling his seatbelt, ready to move if needed. His body was coiled like a spring, every muscle ready for action. He could see other passengers looking uncomfortable, some filming on their phones, but no one was moving to help. Richard grabbed his ruined scotch and held it up. Look at this. This is unacceptable. I want compensation. I want… That's when the turbulence hit again, harder this time. The plane dropped suddenly. That stomach-lurching feeling that makes even experienced travelers grip their armrests. Richard stumbled and the glass flew from his hand, scotch splashing across the seats. Lily let out a small scream, more from fear of Richard than the turbulence. She buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder, and something in Richard snapped. I am so sick of this, he shouted, his voice filling the entire cabin. Sick of having to deal with… His hand came up, pointing at Lily. And then it wasn't pointing anymore, it was moving fast. Faster than Rose could react. Faster than the flight attendants could stop him, but not faster than David could see it happening. The Navy SEAL was already out of his seat, already moving, his body operating on pure instinct and years of training, because he knew what was coming next, could see it unfolding like a mission going wrong, and he knew he had exactly seconds to stop something terrible from happening to that little girl. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as David sprinted up the aisle, his face set with grim determination, racing against a moment that would change everything. David's hand shot out and caught Richard's wrist mid-swing, stopping it inches from Lily's face. The impact of flesh meeting flesh made a sharp sound that echoed through the silent cabin. For a split second, everything froze. Richard's face twisted in rage. Lily's tear-stained cheeks, Rose's protective arms around her granddaughter, and David's iron grip holding everything in place. That's enough, David said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. The kind of voice that had commanded men in life-or-death situations. Richard's head whipped around, his eyes wild. Get your hands off me! Who do you think you are? Someone who's not going to let you hurt a child, David replied, his tone still calm but his grip tightening slightly. Years of hand-to-hand combat training meant he knew exactly how much pressure to apply, enough to control without causing injury. Richard tried to yank his arm free, but it didn't budge. David might as well have been made of steel. The businessman's face went from red to purple as he realized he was completely immobilized. Let go of me right now or I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested. Richard sputtered, trying to pull away again with his free hand reaching up to shove at David's chest. That was a mistake. In one smooth motion, David redirected Richard's momentum, using the man's own force against him. It was a basic defensive technique, the kind they taught in the first weeks of training but executed with the precision of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Richard found himself turned around, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that wasn't quite painful but made it very clear who was in control here. We're going to walk to the back of the plane now, David said, his voice still eerily calm. And you're going to sit down quietly while the crew figures out what to do with you. Understand? I didn't do anything, Richard protested, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Fear was starting to creep in, replacing the rage. She's the one who ruined my drink. This is self-defense. Several passengers nearby actually laughed at that. Short, bitter sounds. One man a few rows back called out, "Self-defense against an 8-year-old? Are you serious right now?" The two flight attendants quickly moved into action. The woman grabbed the zip ties they kept in the emergency equipment, something most passengers didn't know planes carried, while the male attendant spoke rapidly into his radio, updating the cockpit on the situation. "Sir, we need you to cooperate," the male flight attendant said to Richard. "The captain has been notified and local authorities will meet us when we land." "This is insane. I want to speak to your supervisor. I want—" Richard's demands were cut short as David applied just a tiny bit more pressure, reminding him who was currently in charge. "Stop talking," David said simply, and Richard, perhaps for the first time in his life, actually listened. They moved down the aisle together, David maintaining perfect control while making it look almost easy. Other passengers pulled their legs in to let them pass, many pulling out phones to record. David didn't care about being filmed. He'd done nothing wrong and he knew it. At the back of the plane, near the bathrooms, David helped guide Richard into an empty jump seat usually used by flight attendants. The man sat heavily, all the fight seeming to drain out of him now that he was away from his target. The female flight attendant quickly secured his wrists with the zip ties, following the protocol for restraining an unruly passenger. "You're making a huge mistake," Richard mumbled, but there was no force behind it anymore. He looked around at the faces staring at him, passengers who'd left their seats to see what was happening, and seemed to realize for the first time how badly he'd messed up. David stepped back, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. The whole thing had taken maybe 30 seconds from start to finish, but his heart was pounding like he'd just finished a training run. It was one thing to handle enemy combatants overseas. It was another thing entirely to stop a grown man from attacking a child on a commercial flight. The male flight attendant extended his hand. "Thank you. I'm Kevin. That could have gone a lot worse if you hadn't stepped in." David shook his hand. "David Torres. Just glad I was here. You former military?" Kevin asked, keeping his voice low. "Current. Navy." Kevin nodded knowingly. "That explains it. The way you moved, most people would have just thrown a punch. You kept control of the whole situation." "Throwing punches on a plane isn't smart," David said with a slight smile. "For anybody." Back in row 12, Rose was holding Lily tight, both of them shaking. Other passengers nearby were leaning in, offering comfort and words of support. An older gentleman handed Rose some tissues. A woman across the aisle asked if they needed anything. David walked back up the aisle and the passengers spontaneously began to clap. It started with one person, then spread through the cabin like a wave. David felt his face heat up with embarrassment. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. On missions, you did your job and that was it. No applause, no recognition. "I'm just glad the little girl is okay," he said to no one in particular, waving off the praise. When he reached row 12, he knelt down in the aisle so he was at Lily's eye level. The little girl was still pressed against her grandmother, her face buried in Rose's shoulder. David could see her small body trembling. "Hey there," David said softly. "My name's David. Is it okay if I talk to you for a minute?" Lily slowly turned her head, peeking out at him with red, swollen eyes. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and she was clutching that stuffed rabbit so tight her knuckles were white. "You're safe now," David continued, his voice gentle. "That man can't bother you anymore. He's sitting way in the back, and he's going to stay there for the rest of the flight, okay?" Lily nodded slightly but didn't speak. Rose wiped her own eyes, trying to compose herself. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what he was going to do, but—" "You don't have to thank me," David interrupted gently. Any decent person would have done the same thing. But they both knew that wasn't true. The cabin had been full of people, and David had been the only one to move. That was the reality of situations like this. Everyone hoped someone else would step up. Kevin appeared with a first aid kit. "Let me take a look at her, make sure she's all right." But Lily shrank back when he approached, clearly still frightened of any man getting close to her. David noticed immediately. "How about this?" David said. "I've got a daughter about your age at home. Her name's Sophia. And you know what? She loves to color too. Would it be okay if I sat here for a little bit? You don't have to talk to me. I just want to make sure you're feeling better." Lily looked at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. Then, very slowly, she nodded too. David carefully moved into Richard's now empty seat, making sure to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. He noticed Lily's crayons scattered everywhere and began picking them up, organizing them by color. "You know," he said conversationally, not looking directly at Lily but keeping his voice warm. "My daughter Sophia is 7 and she's obsessed with coloring, especially butterflies. She must have 20 butterfly coloring books at home." Lily's grip on her rabbit loosened slightly. "I like butterflies too," she whispered. It was the first time she'd spoken since the incident, and Rose let out a small sob of relief. "Yeah? What's your favorite kind?" David asked, still organizing the crayons. "Monarchs. They're orange and black." "Those are really cool," David agreed. He held up an orange crayon. "Is this the right color?" Lily nodded and David handed it to her. Then he found a black one and offered that too. Slowly, carefully, the little girl took them from his hand. Kevin had been watching this whole exchange and caught on quickly. "I bet you're thirsty after all that excitement," he said to Rose. "How about I get both of you some juice? And maybe some cookies from first class?" "That would be wonderful, thank you," Rose said gratefully. As Kevin walked away, David continued talking to Lily in that same calm, steady voice. He told her about Sophia, about their dog Bruno, who was afraid of the vacuum cleaner, about the time Sophia tried to give their cat a bath and ended up soaking wet herself. Small, silly stories that had nothing to do with what had just happened, but everything to do with helping a traumatized child remember that the world still had good, safe people in it. Gradually, Lily began to relax. Her breathing slowed. The death grip on her rabbit eased. She even smiled a tiny bit when David told her about Bruno running away from a butterfly. Rose watched this stranger, this hero, patiently working to undo the damage that another stranger had caused, and she felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. In a world that had taken so much from her granddaughter, here was someone giving something back. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank everyone for their patience during that disruption. We've notified authorities at LAX and appropriate measures are being taken. For the remainder of the flight, please know that our crew is here for you if you need anything. Thank you to the passenger who assisted. Your service to our country clearly didn't end when you put on civilian clothes." More applause rippled through the cabin, and David felt his ears burn. But he stayed focused on Lily because that was what mattered right now. "You're very brave, you know that?" he told her quietly. Lily shook her head. "I was scared." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," David explained. "It means you keep going even when you are scared. And you did that. You're still here, still being strong for your grandma. That's real bravery." Lily thought about that for a moment. Then she carefully opened her coloring book to the butterfly page and started coloring. Her small hand steadier now, and David sat with her, a warrior trained for combat, using his strength in the gentlest way possible to help one little girl feel safe again. The next hour of the flight felt different than the first. The cabin had settled into a new kind of quiet, not the uncomfortable silence from before, but something softer. People kept glancing back toward where Richard sat restrained, then forward to row 12 where Lily was coloring again, and there was a shared sense of relief that hung in the air like sunshine after a storm. David had stayed in the seat next to Lily, even though it wasn't technically his. Nobody complained. Kevin had checked with the captain, and they'd agreed that having someone calm and capable sitting with the grandmother and child was probably the best arrangement for everyone involved. Lily was working on her butterfly now, carefully filling in the wings with orange and black. Her hand still trembled occasionally, but less than before. Every few minutes she would glance at David as if checking that he was still there, and he would give her a small nod or a reassuring smile. Rose had finally stopped crying, though her eyes were still puffy. She kept her hand on Lily's shoulder, that constant grandmother touch that said, "I'm here, you're safe, we're together." "Can I ask you something?" Rose said quietly to David, her voice barely above a whisper so Lily wouldn't hear. "What made you step in?" "Most people they just watch. They record on their phones, but they don't actually do anything." David was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have a daughter," he said finally. "And I kept thinking, what if someone treated Sophia that way? What if she was scared and alone and nobody helped her?" He shook his head. I couldn't just sit there. I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror. Rose nodded, wiping at her eyes again. Well, thank God you were here. I don't know what would have happened if... Her voice broke and she couldn't finish the sentence. But it didn't happen, David said firmly. That's what matters. She's okay. You're both okay. Are we, though? Rose asked. And now there was something deeper in her voice, a weariness that went beyond just this flight. I keep trying to tell myself that things will get better, that we'll get through this, but... She looked at her granddaughter, her expression full of love and pain. Her parents died 3 months ago. Car accident. And now we're moving because I can't afford to keep us both in my apartment. Her whole world has been turned upside down, and today this man... She trailed off again. David felt his chest tighten. He'd seen a lot of hard things in his career, things that would give most people nightmares. But hearing about this little girl's life, about everything she'd already been through at such a young age, hit him differently. This wasn't some distant problem. This was right here, right now, sitting next to him. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. That's not fair. Not for either of you. No, Rose agreed. It's not. But we don't get to choose what life throws at us, do we? We just have to deal with it. That's true, David said. But you don't have to deal with it alone. You've got family in California, right? That's where you're headed? My daughter, Lily's aunt. She's got a bigger place, better schools nearby. It's the right move, I know it is. It's just... Rose looked out the window at the clouds passing by. It's hard leaving everything behind. Starting over. David understood that feeling better than most. Military life meant moving every few years, new bases, new houses, new schools for Sophia. It was never easy, even when you knew it was necessary. Starting over is scary, he acknowledged, but it also means new chances, new possibilities. And this little one here, he gestured to Lily, who was now adding details to her butterfly's antennae. She's tougher than she looks. Kids are resilient in ways that surprise us. As if hearing them talk about her, Lily looked up from her coloring. David, yeah? Do you really think I'm brave? The question was so earnest, so vulnerable, that David felt something crack in his chest. He shifted in his seat so he was facing her more directly. I don't just think it, he said. I know it. You want to know how I know? Lily nodded, her eyes wide and attentive. Because being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what you need to do anyway. You got on this airplane even though you'd never flown before. That took courage. And when something scary happened, you held on to your grandma and you got through it. That's bravery, Lily, real bravery. But I cried, she said softly, as if this was somehow shameful. Hey, you know what? I've seen the toughest soldiers in the world cry. Crying doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And there's nothing wrong with being human. Lily considered this, her small face serious. Then she did something unexpected. She held out her coloring book to David. Do you want to color with me? David glanced at Rose, who was smiling through fresh tears. He took the book carefully. I'd be honored, but I should warn you I'm not very good at staying in the lines. That's okay, Lily said, handing him a blue crayon. Grammy says it's more fun when you don't worry about the lines so much. So they colored together, a Navy SEAL and an 8-year-old girl, 30,000 feet in the air. Other passengers walked by on their way to the bathroom and smiled at the scene. An elderly woman stopped and told Rose how wonderful it was to see people helping each other. A teenage boy gave David a thumbs up. Kevin came by again with sandwiches and more juice. Compliments of the captain, he said with a wink. And I have a message for you, David. There's someone back in row 23 who wants to talk to you when you get a chance. He says he recorded the whole thing on his phone. David nodded but didn't immediately get up. He was in the middle of coloring a flower, and Lily was giving him very specific instructions about which colors to use. This felt more important than talking to another passenger right now. But eventually, after Lily had approved his flower and moved on to a new page, David excused himself and walked back a few rows. The man who'd filmed everything was in his mid-40s, wearing a business casual outfit and glasses. Hey, I'm Andrew Chen, the man said, extending his hand. I'm a journalist with the LA Times. I got the whole incident on video and it's already gotten like 3 million views online. People are calling you a hero. David felt uncomfortable immediately. I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do. But that's the thing. Not everyone does it, Andrew pointed out. Look, I'd love to interview you when we land. Get your story. Talk about why you intervened. This is the kind of positive news people need to hear right now. David shook his head. I appreciate it, but this isn't about me. It's about that little girl and her grandmother. They're the ones who went through something traumatic. They're the story if there is one. Andrew looked surprised but nodded slowly. That's actually really refreshing. Most people would jump at the chance for this kind of attention. Most people haven't seen what happens when you become famous for something like this, David said quietly. It stops being about helping and starts being about the attention. I don't want that. I just want to make sure Lily and Rose are okay. Fair enough, Andrew said. But can I at least get your last name? People are going to want to know who you are. Torres, David said reluctantly. David Torres. But really, let's keep the focus on the fact that racism and violence against children is never okay. That's the message that matters. When David returned to his seat, Lily had finished another butterfly and was starting on a third. She seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off her small shoulders. Rose was reading her book but looked more relaxed than she had in hours. Everything okay? Rose asked. Yeah, David said, settling back into his seat. Just someone wanting to talk about what happened. But I told him the important thing is making sure you two are all right. We are, Rose said. And for the first time, she actually sounded like she meant it. Thanks to you. The plane flew on, carrying its passengers toward California and whatever futures awaited them there. In the back, Richard sat in silence, his expensive suit wrinkled, his wrists still bound, facing consequences he'd probably never imagined when he'd woken up that morning. In row 12, a grandmother and her granddaughter colored pictures with a stranger who'd become a guardian angel. And David thought about his own daughter waiting for him at home, about how he'd hold her a little tighter tonight, about how he'd tell her this story someday when she was old enough to understand it. He'd tell her about being brave enough to stand up when others won't, about using your strength to protect people who can't protect themselves, about how sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant shores but in the everyday moments when someone needs help and you have the power to give it. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Folks, we're beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. 20 minutes. And then this flight would be over. This strange and terrible and ultimately hopeful journey would end, and everyone would go their separate ways. But David had a feeling that this wasn't really an ending at all. It was just the beginning of something else. The wheels touched down on the runway with a gentle bump, and Lily squeezed her grandmother's hand. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was excitement. She'd made it through her first flight, and despite everything that had happened, she was ready to see what came next. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings from the overhead bins, but everyone was moving slowly, deliberately, and David noticed that people kept looking back toward where Richard was still restrained. There was an unspoken agreement that nobody was going to rush off and leave until they saw this through to the end. The captain's voice came over the speaker one final time. Folks, please remain seated for just a few more minutes. We have law enforcement boarding the aircraft and we need to handle some business before regular deplaning begins. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Within minutes, 4 uniformed officers walked down the aisle, 2 from the FBI and 2 from airport security. They moved with purpose but not aggression, professional and efficient. Kevin met them halfway and spoke quietly, gesturing toward the back of the plane where Richard sat. David watched as they approached Richard, read him his rights, and escorted him off the plane. The businessman kept his head down, not making eye contact with anyone. All the bluster and rage from earlier was completely gone. He looked small now, defeated, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd done. One of the FBI agents, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stopped at row 12. Mrs. Johnson, I'm Special Agent Patricia Hayes. We're going to need statements from you, your granddaughter, and the gentleman who intervened, but we can do that in a more comfortable setting inside the terminal. Would that be all right? Rose nodded, gathering their things. Lily clutched her coloring book and her rabbit, staying close to her grandmother's side. And you're David Torres? The agent asked, turning to him. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for what you did today. We've already reviewed the video footage from multiple passengers. What that man did constitutes assault of a minor on a federal aircraft, along with several other charges. Your intervention likely prevented something even worse from happening. David just nodded. He didn't want praise. He wanted to make sure Lily and Rose were okay and then get home to his own family. As passengers finally began to deplane, several stopped to speak to David. An elderly man shook his hand and thanked him for his service. A young mother with 2 kids told him he was an inspiration. A teenager asked if he could take a photo with him. "I'm really just trying to get home," David said politely but firmly. "But thank you." Lily tugged on his sleeve. "David, are you leaving now?" He knelt down so he was at her eye level, the way he'd done throughout the flight. "Well, I've got to go give a statement to the police officers just like you and your grandma do. But after that, yeah, I need to get home. My wife and daughter are waiting for me." Lily's face fell slightly. "Oh, okay." Something in her expression made David's heart ache. This little girl had already lost so much, and now she was losing another person who'd made her feel safe, even if just for a few hours. "Hey," he said gently, "just because I'm going home doesn't mean we can't stay in touch. If it's okay with your grandma, maybe I could give you my email address. You could send me pictures of your coloring. Tell me how you're doing in California." Lily's face lit up. "Really?" "Really," David confirmed, looking up at Rose for permission. Rose was wiping her eyes again, but she was smiling. "That would be wonderful. Thank you, David. For everything." They gathered their belongings and walked off the plane together, an unlikely trio bound by circumstances neither had expected when they'd boarded that morning. The gate area was chaotic, full of waiting passengers and people greeting arriving travelers. But off to the side, David could see a woman scanning the crowd anxiously. Probably Lily's aunt. "Aunt Bethany," Lily called out, waving. The woman turned and her face flooded with relief. She was younger than Rose, probably in her late 30s, with the same warm eyes as Lily. She rushed over and swept Lily up in a tight hug, then embraced Rose just as fiercely. "I was so worried when I heard there was an incident on your flight," Bethany said, her voice shaking. "They wouldn't tell me any details, just that there was a disturbance and a delay. Are you both okay?" Rose and David exchanged glances. "It's a long story," Rose said. "But yes, we're okay now, thanks to this man right here." David was introduced to Bethany and she insisted on getting his contact information as well. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "This little girl is my world. If something had happened to her—" "Nothing did," David interrupted gently. "That's what matters." They were interrupted by Agent Hayes, who needed to take their statements. David gave his first, recounting the events clearly and factually, the way he'd been trained to report mission details. He had the advantage of having observed the situation from the beginning, noticing Richard's escalating behavior long before it became physical. "The video evidence is pretty damning," Agent Hayes told him after reviewing his statement. "Multiple witnesses, clear footage of the assault attempt, and your intervention was textbook self-defense and defense of others. Mr. Crawford is looking at federal charges that could put him away for several years." "Good," David said simply. While Rose and Lily gave their statements, David called his wife. She'd been tracking his flight and had seen the news reports about an incident aboard Flight 447. "I'm okay, honey," he assured her. "I'll tell you everything when I get home. But I'm fine. Just going to be a little later than expected. The news is saying a Navy SEAL stopped someone from attacking a child on your flight," his wife said carefully. "That was you, wasn't it?" "Yeah," David admitted. "That was me. Are you okay?" "Really, I'm good. Just tired. And I really want to hug you and Sophia right now." "We'll be here," she said softly. "We're proud of you, David. Come home safe." After the statements were completed, Agent Hayes handed David a business card. "If you need anything or if you think of additional details, please contact me. And Mr. Torres, what you did today matters. I know you probably just see it as doing the right thing, but that little girl is going to remember that someone stood up for her when she needed it most. That's going to stay with her." David pocketed the card and went to find Lily, Rose, and Bethany. They were sitting in the gate area, Lily showing her aunt the butterfly she'd colored on the plane. "I'm going to head out," David said, shouldering his duffel bag. Lily jumped up and ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his waist in a tight hug. David was surprised but hugged her back carefully. "Thank you for protecting me," she whispered. "You're very welcome." "Brave girl," he whispered back. Rose hugged him too, and even Bethany, despite having just met him, gave him a grateful embrace. They exchanged email addresses and phone numbers, promises to stay in touch that David actually intended to keep. "You ever need anything," David told them, "and I mean anything, You call me. Understand? They promised they would. David walked through the terminal toward baggage claim, exhausted but somehow lighter than he'd felt in weeks. His phone kept buzzing with messages, friends who'd seen the viral video, colleagues from his unit congratulating him, even a few messages from reporters asking for interviews. He ignored most of them. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what was right when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, David received an email with a photo attached. It was from Rose, and the picture showed Lily in her new school uniform, standing in front of a colorful mural, grinning from ear to ear. The email said she was adjusting well, making friends and seeing a counselor who was helping her process everything she'd been through. She talks about you all the time, Rose wrote. You're her hero. Thank you for showing her that there are still good people in the world who will stand up when it counts. David saved the photo and showed it to Sophia that evening. His daughter looked at the picture carefully, then at her father. Did you really stop a bad man from hurting her, Daddy? I did, David confirmed. Good, Sophia said firmly. Then more thoughtfully, would someone help me like that if I needed it? David pulled his daughter onto his lap. I hope so, sweetheart. But more importantly, I hope that when you grow up, you'll be the kind of person who helps others when they need it. That's what real strength is for, not to hurt people, but to protect them. Sophia nodded seriously, as if filing this information away for future reference. Over the following months, David stayed in regular contact with Lily and her family. He sent her care packages with art supplies and books. They video chatted occasionally, and he got to watch her confidence slowly rebuild. The trauma hadn't disappeared. It probably never would completely, but she was healing, surrounded by people who loved her and supported her. Richard Crawford, meanwhile, pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including assault of a minor, hate crimes, and interfering with a flight crew. He received a 3-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay damages. The airline banned him for life, and his company quietly let him go after the video went viral. Justice had been served. But more than that, a little girl who'd lost everything had been shown that the world still held people worth trusting. A grandmother had been reminded that asking for help wasn't weakness. And a Navy SEAL had learned that sometimes the most important missions don't happen on battlefields. They happen in ordinary moments when ordinary people make the extraordinary choice to act. Harvidam never considered himself a hero for what he did that day. He was just a man who saw someone who needed help and refused to look away. But maybe that's what heroism really is, not grand gestures or seeking glory, but simply standing up when standing up matters most. And on Flight 447, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that's exactly what he'd done. The rest, as they say, was just the beginning of a beautiful friendship.